Dear students, welcome to this lecture. Today, our topic of deliberation is poverty as a challenge in South Asia. The objectives for this lecture are to comprehend the debates around the concept of poverty, to explore the all-over scenario of poverty in South Asia, to know the status of poverty in various South Asian states, and to explore the possible ways through which South Asian states address the problem of poverty. Poverty is nothing new, yet definitions and responses have constantly changed as a result of events and developments in the knowledge. The Millennium Development Goals were a series of 8 targets that United Nations member states signed up in 2000. Their primary goal was described as halving the world's poverty by 2015, and the subsequent Sustainable Development Goals of 2012 were equally focused on ending poverty. However, these seemingly altruistic and worthy visions can only be enacted by use of measures and targets that presume agreement on who is poor, what defines poverty, and crucially, how these people exit poverty. Poverty is clearly linked to people, and while the Millennium Development Goals embrace a largely economic interpretation of poverty, there exists a widespread debate about the extent to which poverty is also physical, social, political, and psychological. Broadly, poverty is conceptualized as a deficiency or shortage of some sort, typically in comparison either to living standards of others within the same society or to universal measures of adequate provision. Historically, this shortage has been considered synonymous with the lack of income or at least insufficient income to meet a household's daily need. However, more recently, there has been a growing awareness that poverty and being poor are about more than just material wealth. Nevertheless, while the multidimensionality of poverty is now widely recognized, there is less agreement about the relative importance of non-monetary factors, particularly qualitative indicators such as personal happiness and fulfillment. Economic definitions of poverty tend to concentrate on either income, such as 1.25 US dollars per day poverty line established by the World Bank, or expenditure, such as the basket of goods assessment. The former measures absolute poverty in terms of where a household's income falls on the universal poverty line, whereas later assesses relative poverty in terms of whether a household can afford to buy the basic goods necessary for survival within their specific context. However, while these economic assessments continue to have significant influence in defining and measuring poverty, taken on their own, they are now recognized as incomplete and inadequate. In particular, poverty lines are criticized for their sharp distinction between being poor under the line and not poor over the line, a distinction that rarely reflects people's lived experience. Furthermore, the economic measures of poverty established in 1960s are criticized for ignoring the social, political, and psychological elements of poverty. Consequently, in the late 1970s, a focus on understanding poverty as inadequate access to basic needs emerged, such as healthcare, education, housing, and services. While this basic needs approach expanded the previous economic focus of poverty measures, it continued to conceptualize poverty as being about physical and material needs. By the 1990s, The idea of poverty as multidimensional had become widely recognized. Indeed, the World Bank's World Development Report captured this multidimensional perspective by combining a basic need approach with more social and political poverty indicators such as vulnerability and fear related to violence and powerless and voicelessness. At the same time, and in contrast to World Bank's poverty line approach, the Nobel Prize winning economist Amartya Sen was developing a unique interpretation of development as a freedom, from which he argues that poverty should be measured against concrete capabilities of citizens to live full and creative lives. According to Sen, in 2001, in order to determine if person is poor, one ought to consider what that person is able to do or what that person can achieve. Poverty, then, in sense terms, is defined as the deprivation of capabilities needed by an individual in order to function. In 1997, Sen's approach to understanding poverty was adapted by UNDP and translated into its Human Poverty Index, later renamed the Multidimensional Poverty Index. Thus, during the 1990s, two key global developmental institutions, the World Bank and the United Nations, introduced a very different interpretation of how to define poverty, both of which competed for legitimacy. On the one hand, World Bank's reliance on quantitative income-based measures produced a clear data that could be compared across countries. And on the other, United Nations' qualitative approach was far more complex, yet recognized the non-economic dimensions of poverty. Dear students, let's now have a look on poverty condition in South Asia. From the above discussed definitions, we can see that South Asia, with 23% of world's population, is planet's poorest region. About 540 million or 45% of region's population are living below poverty line with daily incomes of less than $1. This proportion is higher than Sub-Saharan Africa, East Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, the Caribbean, and the Pacific region, including China. These income disparities in South Asia are one of the largest challenges in the world. All these countries in the region have a dramatic concentration of wealth and power among their richest members. The highest income earning layer own most of the total income in the region, while the lowest 20% bracket owns almost nothing. From this, one can easily infer that economic development in the region has never benefited the poor. Even though GNP has been rising annually at around 5.4% and per capita income grew at an annual rate of 3%, the average income of richest 10% is still 6 times the average of poorest 10%. In South Asia, 879 million people are deprived of proper sanitary facilities, 661 million in India, 98 million in Pakistan, 91 million in Bangladesh, 18 million in Nepal, and 6 million in Sri Lanka. A total of 278 million people have no access to safe drinking water. 178 million in India, 56 million in Pakistan, 25 million in Bangladesh, 1 million in Nepal, and 0.7 million in Sri Lanka. In addition, 276 million people, or 22% of the entire population, have no access to basic health facilities. That is, 50% of people in Bangladesh, 45% in Pakistan, 15% in India, and 7% in Sri Lanka. Dear students, let's have now look at the country-wise how poverty is proving to be a challenge in South Asia. We will first look at India. The poverty line in India is usually associated with calorie threshold. This calorie threshold approach suffers from many problems. An alternative revealed preference-based approach has been provided by Jensen and Miller, known as JM approach. In this approach, the stable calorie share reveals whether a household is calorie deprived. We use this approach to estimate the extent of poverty in India. Though our poverty estimates are very close to Tendolkar committee estimates for urban sector, for rural sector, our estimates are considerably lower. Pew Research Center, using World Bank data, has estimated that number of poor in India has more than doubled from 60 million to 134 million in just a year because of pandemic-induced recession. This means India is returned to the situation where it's called a country of mass poverty after 70 years of independence. India's population has steadily increased through the years. During the past 45 years, it has risen at the rate of 2.2% per year, which means on average about 17 million people are added to country's population each year. This also increases the demand for consumption goods tremendously. A major reason for the poverty is low productivity in agricultural sector. The reason for low productivity is manifold. Chiefly, it's because of fragmented and subdivided land holdings, lack of capital, illiteracy about new technologies in farming, the use of traditional methods of cultivation, wastage during storage, etc. There is a underemployment and disguised unemployment in the country, particularly in the farming sector. This has resulted in the low agricultural output and also led to dip in standard of living. Price rise has been steady in the country and this has added to the burden of power carried. Although a few people have benefited from this, lower income groups have suffered because of it and are not even able to satisfy their basic minimum wants. Apart from economic and commercial, there are social factors hindering the eradication of poverty in India. Some of the hindrances in this regard are the laws of inheritance, caste system, certain traditions. Dear students, we will see now the problem of poverty in Pakistan. Pakistan, the seventh poorest country in South Asia, is attempting to cope with the multiple dimensions of poverty through numerous initiatives. Since 2001, Pakistan has moved approximately 32 million people out of monetary poverty, and the poverty head count rate measured by consumption-based poverty estimate dropped by 64.3 in 2001 to 24.3 in 2015. However, the poverty rate in Pakistan remains significantly high and a large portion of population is vulnerable, living at or close to the minimum poverty line. Pakistan faces an energy shortage that is impacting the living standard of households. Almost 55% of households are energy deprived in Pakistan. In the absence of higher social spending, the lower middle class income poverty rate is expected to increase to 37.2% in 2022-23, according to the World Bank report on the macro poverty outlook for Pakistan. Given poor households' dependency on agriculture and small-scale manufacturing and construction activity, they remain vulnerable to economic and climate shocks. Health and education outcomes are also at risk as the high inflation and reduced incomes could lead to poor households to lower school attendance and food intake. In 2015, the government of Pakistan announced its long-term growth strategy Vision 2025, designed to overcome the economic, social and security challenge and provide citizens with ability to improve their choices and standards of living. Vision 2025 stresses a more comprehensive definition of poverty that includes education, health, and other dimensions together with monetary indicators. Students, let's see now the problem of poverty in Bangladesh. Like many other developing countries of the world, Bangladesh has been striving to elevate poverty since its independence in 1971. Poverty is one of the major economic problems of the country. More than 146 million people lived in this country with density of 1,109 people per square kilometer. However, it's a very small economy in terms of GDP and per capita income. Despite Bangladesh experienced an impressive economic growth, average more than 5% over the last 2 decades, the declining in poverty over the same period was relatively insignificant. That is, less than 1% annually for below overall GDP per capita growth rate of 3.4% during the same period. It is argued that inequality and uneven distribution of income saw the benefit of economic growth go to the rich rather than the poor. In 2016, about 1 in 4 Bangladeshis were poor. There is also positive side of the story. The country has halved poverty rates in a decade and a half, lifting more than 25 million people out of poverty. Between 2010 and 2016, about 8 million Bangladeshis were lifted out of poverty. Bangladesh is not only one of the top performers in poverty reduction in South Asian region, it's equally top performer in improving non-monetary dimensions of welfare. Students, now let's see some of the small countries in South Asia, like Bhutan. The economy of Bhutan is primarily agricultural, with 95% of population in rural areas, separated thinly over mountains and valleys. The living standard of most of the rural population is very modest, as evident by other indicators as the life expectancy at the birth of 48.9 and an infant mortality rate of 134 per thousand in 1990s. Bhutan ranked 144th in the Human Development Index out of 160 countries listed in Human Development Report. Similarly, we have a country called Maldives. Maldives has a relatively small population of around 21 lakhs. It's richly endowed with plentiful supplies of seafood. Significant improvements in human development achieved during the last decade enabled Maldives to be ranked 99th among the countries listed in Human Development Report. Despite increasing income levels and plentiful supplies of seafood, further qualitative improvements in the food basket can be achieved with targeted nutrition education programs. Then we have a country called Nepal. The first attempt to define and quantitate the level of poverty in Nepal was made by National Planning Commission in 1976-77. The criteria at that time gave poverty estimate of 40.3%. Poverty was estimated to be 40% of the population in late 1990s. With the commencement of 5-year plans, Nepal proposes to use additional measures to assess the magnitude of poverty for the purposes of targeting its poverty elevation programs. One more country in our neighborhood is Afghanistan. Afghanistan is one of the poorest countries in the world. Since the Soviet invasion in 1979, it has been the scene of series conflicts that have continued for more than 4 decades. Poverty in Afghanistan is widespread throughout rural and urban areas. The government estimates that 42% of country's total population lives below poverty line. Another 20% are struggling to make ends meet, which means they could easily fall into poverty. Food insecurity remains the greatest threat to everyday Afghans. Currently, 40% of country's population are facing acute food insecurity and 4th highest figure in the world. people are forced to make impossible choices to put food on the table, and the children are at particularly increased risk of starvation, malnutrition and hunger and preventable disease. Almost 80% of those in need in Afghanistan are women and children, largely as a result of economic crisis alongside relentless restrictions put in place on women in society. As a woman-headed households enduring rising hungers, mothers are forced to send their children to work to earn enough money to purchase food, causing a sharp uptick in the child labor. Dear students, let's explore the possible steps which South Asian states can take to reduce the poverty. Recognizing the fact that one size does not fit all, each nation will need to adapt its own prescription for reducing poverty. However, these are some priority areas that call for an action. Social development. Economic growth can effectively reduce poverty only when accompanied by comprehensive program for social development. Just as some targeting of economic development is necessary to reach bypassed areas, so social development must be targeted. Therefore, every country needs to have a comprehensive national poverty reduction strategy that provides for, number first, adequate budgetary allocation for human capital, number second, targeting of basic social services, number third, removal of gender discrimination, and number fourth, an effective population, lastly, the social protection. Beyond developing human capital, the aim must be to strengthen social capital, especially for people subjected to some form of exclusion. Accordingly, targeted programs will be required in the above said 5 areas. Similarly, we have the notion of good governance. The quality of governance is crucial to poverty reduction. Good governance facilitates participatory pro-poor policies as well as sound macroeconomic management. It ensures the transparent use of public funds, encourages growth of private sector, promotes effective delivery of public services and helps to establish rule of law. A sound macroeconomic framework is needed to encourage efficient and productive domestic investment and to keep inflation low to protect real incomes of the poor. Likewise, it helps prevent interest and exchange rate distortions that artificially reduce the cost of capital and discourage the use of labor. Good public expenditure management is necessary for physical discipline, economic growth and equity. Thus, the creation of political environment can be created so that poor people and communities can be heard rather than suppressed and oppressed. Similarly, we need to look into the dimension of gender and poverty. While nearly 2/3 of the world's poor are in South Asia, more than 1/3 of region's poor are women. And poverty is particularly acute for women living in rural areas. In poor families, the gender division of labor and responsibilities for household welfare means that the burden of poverty falls most heavily on women. Given gender disparities in education, healthcare, economic participation and incomes, women are most vulnerable category. Let's have a look on the trade now. Trade can be a powerful force for growth and poverty reduction. Countries that have increased the share of trade in their GDP have grown faster and reduced poverty to some extent. Investments in trade facilitation, such as improvements in customs and ports, significantly increase trade, thereby boosting growth and creating new opportunities for people to improve their lives. The benefits of trade facilitation will be greater still if rich countries act to remove barriers to trade and open their markets to developing countries' exports, including better trade policies and fairer rules and fair terms of poor countries to enter markets. Lastly, we need to have a look on military expenditure. The military expenditure in South Asia, for example, in 2006 for India was 25,485 US dollars, for Pakistan 4,818 US dollars, for Bangladesh 678 US dollars, for Sri Lanka 663 US dollars, and for Nepal 111 US dollars. Though Bangladesh is higher than Sri Lanka in military expenditure, but per capita GDP of Bangladesh is less than one-third of Sri Lanka. A fraction of the yearly expenditure in defense could even reduce debts and help in economic reversal, including peace-building efforts in war-torn countries, and provide a better living standards for the underprivileged and downtrodden. So dear students, poverty is one of the major challenges which South Asian states are facing from the beginning of their journey as an independent nations. Many reforms have taken place from time to time in these states, but more need to be done to tackle this serious issue. More than merely focusing on increasing per capita income, these states ought to focus on overall development, which has to be inclusive in nature. Common strategies and cooperation among South Asian states will be a positive step in this direction. This was all for today's lecture. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. Thank you.